folks, it's your old pal, the old miner here, and I'm here to tell you about a brand new business I've started. It's Old Miner's Old Mining Adventure Shack. We got all kinds of activities that's fun for the whole family. I can teach you how to mine for gold, and you're gonna be working 16-hour days. Is that not enough fun for you? We'll take a ride on my old donkey, Kenny Rogers Jr. He's as old as I am. And if that's not fun enough for you, I'll even teach you how to open a can of beans. Beans! That's Old Miner's Old Mining Adventure Shack off the nearest highway. Which highway? I don't know. I plumb forgot. See you there.
You know, in the world of horror films, or I guess just kind of films in general, but let's focus on horror movies because it's kind of what the show's about. There are those films that everybody knows about. They're the films that are well regarded or well remembered or fan favorites. It's the type of stuff that even a non-horror fan has probably seen or at least heard of. And then you've got your underrated movies. They're the type of films that you would go and show your friends who maybe haven't seen as many movies as you have. It's the movies where you're like, oh, you haven't seen Reanimator or you haven't seen Videodrome? And then you've got movies that are so terrible that people choose to ignore them or choose to forget them. Or sometimes they're so bad that they're rewatchable because of how terrible they actually are. But in between your underrated and terrible films, I think there's another category. They're kind of the underrated horror movies. They're the type of movies that maybe even your average horror fan hasn't seen or doesn't immediately think of when they think of some of their favorite movies. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. It just means that for one reason or another, they've gotten lost in the shuffle. And you know what? Tonight's film is gonna be one of those movies. And even though I learned about it a while ago, I didn't get around to watching this film until recently, kind of just because I forgot about it. It didn't really stick in my mind as something I had to immediately sit down and watch, and so I kept putting it off and putting it off. But you know what? I'm glad I finally did sit down, because tonight's film, Tourist Trap, is an insanely bonkers and awesome horror flick that deserves way more attention than it's gotten. And so, we're bringing it here, tonight. I'm Ryan Reed, and this is Fright Films. Tourist Trap is a 1979 film directed by David Schmoller and produced by Charles Band. If those names sound familiar at all, it's because later on they would team up once again to create one of the most successful direct-to-video horror franchises of all time, Puppet Master. That's right, this series continues to generate sequels through Band's production company, Full Moon Entertainment. When you break it down, Tourist Trap sounds like any other slasher movie, although it was filmed in 1978, so it was released after Halloween, but before the big slasher craze of the 80s. The plot is pretty straightforward. A group of teens are traveling, their car breaks down, they run across an old man who offers to help them. He takes them to his rundown wax museum, where one by one they're dispatched by a crazy killer in a mask. It sounds, well, pretty basic, but Tourist Trap is anything but basic. But to say any more would really ruin what makes the film so unique. A good place to start is the music, since it does open our movie along with the credits. The score was created by Italian music composer Pino Donaggio, and he went on to create scores for other notable horror movies such as Piranha, the original Piranha that is, and The Howling. But here he creates this weird sort of wind-up music that half the time doesn't fit the movie at all, and then the other half fits the movie way too perfectly for creepy effect. A good example of the former is an early scene where the girls decide to go skinny dipping, and the old man who runs the wax museum, Mr. Slauson, is like watching them, and then he like comes out of the shadows and starts talking to them about like how the highway has caused his wax museum to kind of become run down because no tourists come to visit it and stuff. And the music that starts playing is this sentimental music. But why? Like, I understand that the movie wants us to feel bad for this guy, but at the same time, there's no other way that that scene can come off than just creepy. And so the music unintentionally makes it doubly creepy. But then, a good example of it working is the first death in the movie, which happens fairly quickly. Here, the music builds and builds to this crazy height as all this stuff is happening, and like bottles are being thrown at our character, and he's screaming. The music just builds and builds and builds until finally the character dies, and the music just stops. And it just works so incredibly well that you have to wonder why the other half of the music doesn't. And it's not the only mismatched thing in the film either. See, the teen actors in the movie aren't exactly the greatest. Now, don't get me wrong, their performances aren't awful, but they're not exactly good either. But that just becomes more apparent because they're teamed up with Mr. Slauson, who's played by Chuck Connors. Now, if you don't know Chuck Connors, he was most famous for a role in the Western TV show in the 50s and 60s called The Rifleman. The producers of Tourist Trap wanted an old-timey Hollywood actor to play this role, so they reached out to a couple people, and Chuck Connors was the one who accepted the part. And we should be so glad that he did, because his performance is outstanding in this movie. He is so dedicated to the craziness of this film, and somehow manages to give a grounded and scenery-chewing performance. He makes dialogue about wax figures or his brother that should be just terrible come off as very natural, but then when the movie goes off the rails, his performance and tone matches. It's so well done, and I was engaged every single time he was on screen. And the movie goes on like that. There are times, especially later in the movie, where it just feels like the film doesn't want to follow any sort of structure. It just wants to create pure chaos. I mean, I can even go back to the first opening death scene to kind of set a basic example, and we'll see the bar we're at. I mean, that opening death scene involves a character getting their arm pulled through the door, and as they're screaming and the music's building and all this chaos is happening, there's mannequins laughing at him, and objects are flying off a shelf, and bottles are smashing near him. And then when they die, sorry for the minor spoiler, I won't spoil how he dies, but he does die, everything goes quiet, and then all you hear are the weird grumblings of a killer outside as we pan across a window. It's so insane. The killer is also different than most slasher movie villains. See, he's not completely silent, but he doesn't just sit there and make jokes like Freddy Krueger. Instead, he monologues to these teenagers, and he talks to them about how they're going to die, and he walks them through it, and then he'll sit there and he'll just go on rants about his life. The entire time, he's wearing a mask that makes him look like Zeke the plumber, and then, on top of that, that is just the tip of the iceberg of the madness of this movie. See, you've got scenes with telekinesis, and scenes with screaming mannequin heads, and there's twists, and there's turns, and there's moments of dancing, and the list goes on and on and on. And then on top of all of that, the MPAA only gave this movie a PG rating, despite its many deaths, albeit mostly bloodless, but still, all the deaths, and just overall strangeness, which is just as confusing as Tourist Trap itself. Now, it may have sounded like I was being negative when discussing some of the choices made in the film, but that could not be further from the truth. In fact, I think everything weird in Tourist Trap just adds to its uniqueness and makes it stand out in the slasher genre. It is unapologetic in how out there it is, and there's just something about it that makes it worth a watch, and not in an ironic way, but as a film that should be remembered in its field. So why has Tourist Trap gone under the radar for so long? I mean, don't get me wrong, there are horror fans out there who talk about it, but you almost never see it on those kind of bigger lists of most underrated horror films or slasher films you should see. Instead, it's almost like time has completely wiped it from most people's brains, except for this one very small, dedicated fan group. And honestly, I have no answers. I think Tourist Trap should be seen, and it should be way higher in popularity than it is. So if you're a slasher movie fan or just a fan of weird movies, do yourself a favor and give Tourist Trap a shot. I mean, it's readily available on DVD and Blu-ray, and as of this recording, it's available on a lot of streaming services, including free ones like Tubi. So you have really no excuse to not just sit down and check it out. And let's keep Tourist Trap, this bizarro, one-of-a-kind horror movie, in the conversation. I'm Ryan Reed. Go watch a movie.